The 3 days of fighting at Bronner's Farm, the Warrenton Turnpike, the railroad cut, Chin Ridge, claimed over 20,000 total casualties, 8,350 Confederates in victory, and over 13,800 Federals in defeat. Strategically, the Confederate victory was significant. In the first days of May 1862, George McClellan, as we have noted, and his army were only some 3 miles outside of Richmond. Now, 3 months later, Robert E. Lee and his army were only some 20 miles outside the gates of Washington City. Second Manassas cleared the strategic table in Virginia like no other. It trumpeted a Confederate command chemistry that at the time the North could only dream about. Highlighted Stonewall Jackson's ability to create opportunity. Yes, James Longstreet was cautious, but no one threw a mightier counterpunch. And Robert E. Lee, the architect, guided and masterminded it all. Second Manassas may well have served as perhaps the conflict's best example of the happy marriage between strategy and tactics. Yet the victory cost the Confederates over 8,300 casualties. Lee's men had campaigned hard, and yes, they had won, and morale was high. But supplies were needed. Legs ached, and stomachs were empty. Across the way, Second Manassas undid John Pope. As John J. Hennessy noted in his 1993 work, Return to Bull Run, Pope, after the battle, swung wildly from fits of depression to bursts of combative optimism. To explain defeat, he searched for scapegoats, but in the end, it was he, and he alone, that was responsible for the condition and circumstance of his army. In thrashing about trying to locate Jackson, he ran his cavalry to collapse and made it impossible for his army to be fed and provisioned for more than a week. He allowed Jackson to completely outmaneuver him, and when full battle came, he mounted nothing but disjointed, bloody, unsupported attacks. On August the 30th, he allowed Longstreet to threaten and eventually destroy his left. Yet, for all the faults, there was one positive. John Pope did get his army away, essentially intact after the battle. True, it was not destroyed, but it was yet another Federal reverse, and the ripples of defeat affected many. You see, defeat breeds mistrust, and that ran rampant up and down the channels of the Federal High Command. Within days, Pope targeted Fitz-John Porter, a McClellan man. He had him court-martialed for refusal to obey orders at Second Manassas. Porter was dismissed from the Army January the 21st, 1863, and spent the rest of his days trying to clear his record. As for John Pope, after only 74 days in command, he was reassigned to the Department of the Northwest, where he was ordered to Minnesota to put down the bloody Sioux uprising of 1862. In Washington City, all the turmoil created a sordid whirl of who could be trusted. In back rooms and in hushed voices, the poisonous word treason was leveled at men in high command. As the defeated Army of Virginia and elements of the Army of the Potomac marched back to the gates of Washington, Union morale was as low as Confederate was high. And so the story goes. The line of Union retreat brought them in on the Fairfax Road on the afternoon of September the 2nd. The rain was gone. The sun had returned. And enough warmth and drying out that the long serpent-like line of men in blue marched in a cloud of swirling dust. Pope and Irvin McDowell rode ahead, side by side. Among them and their staffs, a brief interval. Then came John Hatch, his men, the ones that initiated the fight back at Bronner's farm. Like almost all, they stared blankly into the backs of the man in front, one foot shuffling mindlessly in front of the other. And then, out in the road ahead, a little group of horsemen appeared. In the backdrop of defeat and despair, they rode confidently. The man in front on a great black horse, and adorned with a bright yellow sash about his waist, erect and dapper in the saddle. As he rode up to Generals Pope and McDowell, he snapped a salute to them. That was all John Hatch needed to see. There was only one man who saluted like that, and Hatch spurred his horse to the scene. He got there just in time to hear that by order of the President of the United States, the man on the black horse was assuming command of all the troops. It was George Brenton McClellan. Hatch smiled. He had a score to settle with John Pope, whom he hated. Pope, when he first came east, dressed him down for failure to complete missions that he, Pope, helped to scuttle. Hatch now saw his chance to get even. He trotted back a few paces from the three officers, and in a loud voice, easily heard by both McDowell and Pope, shouted, "Boys, McClellan is in command of the army again. 3 cheers!" There was a brief stunned silence, and then a wild yell went up. Hats, caps, and knapsacks were thrown into the air, and the roar cascaded all the way down the long blue line. It was a delirious joy, and it roared unabated. A moment soldiers remembered for the rest of their lives. Little Mac was back. He would have yet another chance to, as he put it a year earlier, to save the Union. And indeed, the Union needed saving, for Lee had cleared Virginia and driven the enemy within the defenses of Washington City. Out in the west, Confederate General Edmund Kirby Smith threatened Frankfort, Kentucky, and Braxton Bragg's Confederate Army of Tennessee was moving north toward Kentucky. Louisville and Cincinnati were under martial law. On September the 4th, as burial details cleared the landscape at Manassas and Ox Hill, the vanguard of Lee's Army of Northern Virginia splashed north across the Potomac River, singing, "O Maryland, My Maryland." On a 1,000-mile front, the Confederacy was pushing the issue for its independence. A Richmond paper captured the moment when it noted, "Mighty events, mightier than any that have yet occurred, are evidently on the wing." For Robert E. Lee and George B. McClellan and their men, those mighty events carried them 13 days later to a small town in western Maryland, where ripening corn, verdant rolling fields, and pastures belied a nation at war with itself. That tranquil landscape dissected by a picturesque stream, a body of water known as Antietam Creek.